Hi everyone, it's Rahul. So today we are going to discuss about what is Kubernetes services and what are the various type of Kubernetes services along with their use cases. So we will discuss all of them in detail along with doing hands-on lab. So now let's first discuss what is Kubernetes services. So suppose if you have containerized your application and you have deployed that containerized application in terms of pod in Kubernetes cluster, and you want your application which is running in container in terms of pod to have a exposed outside of the cluster or to have a internal communication with other pod in the same cluster. To achieve this requirement, we need to use Kubernetes services. So to answer this question, what are the various type of Kubernetes services? So mainly we are using only three of them Kubernetes services. The first one would be the ClusterIP as a service. The second one would be the NodePort as a service. And the third one and the mostly used in production or in live environment, that is LoadBalancer as a service. Our other two services as well. The first one is a Headless as a service and the second one is a Externalname as a service. So ClusterIP as a service is also known as default service of Kubernetes. What does it mean by default service of Kubernetes? It means that if you are creating a service type in Kubernetes cluster and if you're not defining the type of service, so Kubernetes understand that and you want your application not to be exposed outside of the cluster, so it will create ClusterIP as a service for your pod or application. So let's proceed and see each of the services in details along with their use cases. And apart from that, we will discuss all of these services in detail with hands-on labs as well. Now let's discuss cluster IP as a service. So as we have discussed that if we have a requirement that the pod or application which is containerized and running inside our Kubernetes cluster, and if we have to internal communication with another pod which is also running in the same Kubernetes cluster, so we can use this cluster IP as a service so that to have an internal communication inside the same cluster between multiple pods. So this is also known as default service of Kubernetes. We have already discussed why it is called as the default service of Kubernetes. So as you can see here, the use cases for this cluster IP as a service that it's only accessible within the cluster. So typically used for inter-pod communications inside the same cluster. So I have shared the snap and as an attachment as well. As you can see here, this Kubernetes service which is running as a cluster IP, this service would be created automatically whenever you are setting up your cluster from scratch. So this is the cluster IP has been associated, and I have deployed a Nginx application and deployment in Kubernetes resources. So I have created a service for that in terms of cluster IP. So I'm sharing that snap. So name is showing as an Nginx, type is cluster IP, and this is the IP which is being associated with my Nginx cluster IP service. External IP is showing as none because in cluster IP as a service, we are not exposing our application or a pod to outside of the cluster. That's why external IP is showing as none. And on which port we are exposing it, that is 80. And the age, it's that 4 seconds, means that 4 seconds earlier this particular service is being created. Now let's proceed and do some hands-on lab to see what is the cluster IP as a service. Now let's discuss while doing the hands-on lab and try to expose our application which is running in the form of container in Kubernetes cluster. So let's first create a deployment. Create deploy, and name of the deployment would be the Nginx, and what would be the image. So as of now we are going with Nginx, and what with the replica count, so let it be going with 2 for now. So as we can see here, our deployment has been created, get deploy. So all the pods are in ready state now. So try to see the pods, get pods. So let me tell you, I have already set alias for kubectl sk. That's why I'm using k, not kubectl. So it try to minimize the time for typing the command kubectl. So that's why. So now the pods are created. Now let's try to see what's the label. As we already know, services are using labels and selector of the pods or a deployment to be exposed internal or outside of the cluster. So let me see, get deploy hyphen show hyphen labels. Okay, now we know that the label on this deployment is app is equal to nginx. Now let's try to expose this application. Expose deploy and name of the deployment nginx, and what would be the name of the service we just want, nginx hyphen cluster. And what else we need to pass? Okay, hyphen port, on which port we want this particular container or port to be accessible. Hyphen port is equal to 80, and we are not passing any type of the services, Kubernetes services. So by default, as we have already discussed multiple times, if you're not defining any type of services, so Kubernetes will create a cluster IP as a service. So as you can see here, the service has been created and our pod or deployment has been exposed. So kget services, this is the service which is being created as a cluster IP as a service, nginx hyphen cluster. So this is the cluster IP is being associated, and this is the port. Now let's try to see that the port which is being exposed with this service is correct. Kget service hyphen o wide, it will show the labels as well. So as you can see here, this is the same labels which is being associated with this particular service. So here it would be the selector and here it would be the labels. So labels and selectors are matching, so we are sure that this is the same application which is being exposed with the help of this service. As we know that kget ports hyphen o wide, so our pods are running on worker node. So it means that we can do the curl with this IP on this port in our worker node. So, and we would supposed to receive a response from our application. So I am already logged in my worker node in another Cloud Shell terminal. So what we have to do, we need to do the curl on this particular service cluster IP. So I just copy the IP, and what we have to do, curl and the IP and the port we need to mention. As you can see here, we are getting the nginx response. So it means that our services are being exposed only inside the cluster, not the outside of the cluster. So we can conclude that this is the way how cluster IP as a service is being used in pods to exposed inside the cluster to have a inter-pod communication. Now let's discuss NodePort as a service after the discussion of cluster IP as a service. So basically, NodePort as a service is being used that whenever you want to expose your pod or application which is running inside a container at a static port of a node on which your pod is running, then we can use a NodePort as a service. So this service is being used that if you want your pod to be accessible outside of the cluster, so you can use NodePort as a service. And specifically this type of services is being used for debugging purpose, development, or in testing phase. So as you can see here, how we can make our pod or application to be accessible outside of the cluster, that what we have to pass it on node IP and the node port. So as you can see here, the same application which we have discussed earlier in cluster IP as a service, I have exposed that particular service itself with the help of NodePort, and the node port on which is being exposed is 30036. So this is the node port we have to pass while along with passing the node IP on which our pod is being scheduled. So this is the information and the use case for the NodePort as a service. Now let's proceed and do some hands-on lab and expose our application with NodePort as a service. So now we have already discussed that cluster IP as a service. Now we will discuss NodePort as a service. So we are going to expose the same application with the help of NodePort as a service. So what I'm going to do for now, I'm going to edit the existing cluster IP as a service and try to convert into the NodePort as a service. So cluster IP, we can delete that, we don't want, so it will be automatically assigned. So delete this, and okay, we are good. And the port and the type, we need to pass it here as a node port, and just try to save this. Sorry, my bad. Okay, So now the services has been edited. Now let's see kget service. As you can see here, our service cluster IP is being converted to NodePort and the type is NodePort. And as we have already know that the port number which is being allocated for the NodePort as a service, that lies in the range between 30,000 to 32,767. So automatically one of the port has been assigned for this particular Nginx cluster. So this is the cluster IP. So what, as we have already know how we have to pass the the node IP colon and the node port to access our application. Okay, so we have to pass in this way to access our application. Now let me see and try to do so. What we have to do, let's first see this, the service NodePort is applied only to our Nginx pod kget service -o byte. So as we can see here, this NodePort is applied to our Nginx pod only. So now what we will do, curl, what will be the node IP? So because NodePort is going to expose our application outside of the cluster, so we are going to try to do a curl outside of the worker node, that would be master node only. So let me try to see worker node. This is the external IP. So this is our IP we required and the NodePort 131509. So let's see, we are trying to do a curl. If that particular port is accessible, so as of now in GCP we need to allow a firewall rule to be expose our a particular port. So it seems that this particular port is not exposed on that worker node, so that's why we are not getting a response. So let me try to enable a firewall, VPC network, firewalls, create a firewall rule. Name would be just like as allow NodePort and default, let it be the ingress specific. I'm just applying for the all instances in the network from anywhere. Okay, sorry, what we have to pass it or not. Now we have to choose the TCP and what's the port which is being exposed here, 31509. So 31509 we need to mention it here and the create it. So just wait for the firewall rule to be created and need to be applied on this particular all the instances in our particular network, that is master and worker node. So that's why we are not getting a response. So let me show you as well. -v, as you can see here, we are getting the response now connected because we have already opened a firewall on this particular port. That's why we got the response. So I hope you guys follow the same and have discussed ClusterIP as a service and NodePort as a service, how our application is exposed inside the cluster and outside the cluster on a particular node with the help of NodePort. So let me show you. So I have opened the firewall. Now I can access my application on a particular NodePort. So this is it for NodePort as a service. Discussion of NodePort as a service. Now let's discuss what is load balancer as a service, and this service is being useful for production, and this is the mostly use Kubernetes services. So if you wanted your services to be exposed externally using cloud provider load balancer, you can use the load balancer as a service. So it would automatically create an external load balancer that route the traffic to the services. So this services, as I have already told, this is being used only for production environment and which is being supported for all cloud environments, cloud platforms, we can say that. As we have seen here, the snap which I have attached in the load balancer as a service, the same application which I have exposed as a node cluster IP as a service, then after NodePort as a service, the same application which is running inside a pod, I just exposed is as a load balancer as a service, and this is the cluster IP which is being associated with that particular service, and external IP as you can see here showing as a pending. So it means that as of now my setup is running on GCP VMs, but I haven't enabled load balancer on that. That's why external IP is showing as pending. When I enable it, automatically external IP would be associated with my with my VMs, and we can access our application on that particular external IP or on this port. So this is the information about load balancer as a service. Now let's proceed and do some hands-on lab and see how we can expose our application with the help of load balancer as a service. Now let's proceed and try to create a load balancer as a service for exposing the same application outside of the cluster with the help of load balancer. So kget svc, kget svc. Now we are going to now we are going to edit the existing service and try to convert into from NodePort to load balancer as a service. So nginx cluster, copy it, paste it here, just try to edit it, remove this cluster IP. Okay, what else we have to remove? We need to change the type and we need to remove this, because as we know that subset, when we're discussing about the we can say that positioning or the types. So cluster IP is a subset of NodePort and the NodePort is a subset of load balancer as a service. So NodePort, it's not an issue. We need to pass here the type load balancer. Let's try to see that. Sorry, my bad. Okay, the name would be B would be in a capital letter. Let's change it. Okay, sorry, I need to be in edited mode. Load balancer. Okay, now the service has been edited. Now let's see kget svc. As we can see here, the external IP is showing as a pending for now because I haven't enabled my load balancer in my GCP virtual machine. So that's why there is no external IP is being enabled. So now whenever our external IP is being allocated after enabling the load balancer, we can see the same way like we have seen in ClusterIP or NodePort, our services will show the response. Okay, now let's discuss the headless as a service and external name as a service. Headless as a service is also comes under the cluster IP as a service. This is not a separate service. Basically, you can convert your cluster IP as a service to a headless as a service. It's all depend upon your requirement. If you are running a stateful pod, just like as database or where each pod need to be directly accessible inside the cluster, so you can use headless as a service. What we have to pass it on that, it means that if you want your pod to be accessible with the pod IP rather than a cluster IP, so you have to pass cluster IP as a none in Kubernetes service to define or to convert your cluster IP to headless as a service, so that whenever you do a curl to a particular pod, you are going to use a pod IP rather than a cluster IP. We'll see all of these information which I am discussing here in headless as a service in detail in hands-on lab. Now let's discuss what's the description and the use case mentioned over here. So as you can see here, it shows that doesn't allocate a cluster IP. Instead, it returns the IP addresses of the pod directly, which I am discussing right now. So this is being used for the stateful application like databases where each pod need to be directly accessible. So I have already created headless. As you can see here, cluster IP in that particular headless service is showing as none. Because in the cluster IP it's showing as none, then automatically that service, it would be converted into the headless as a service, and the external IP is none because this is a cluster IP service, and port on which it's being exposed, that is 80. So this is the information about headless as a service. Now let's proceed and do some hands-on lab and try to expose an application with the help of headless as a service, and we'll try to see that are we able to do the curl to that particular pod or not with the help of pod IP. Now let's create the remaining two, that is external name as a service and headless as a service. So kget services we have already seen, load balancer, cluster IP and NodePort we have already created and exposed our nginx pod which is running as a deployment to inside or outside of the cluster. So let's try to create create. So I have already created a YAML and create a manifest for headless as a service. So let me show you vi test.yaml. So here, as we have already know what we have to do, cluster IP marked as none and selector app is equal to nginx. So this service would be created as a headless as a service. So k create -f s.yaml. So as we can see here, this is being created. So don't get confused here that it is also showing as type is cluster IP, because headless is a subtype of cluster IP. As you can see here, cluster IP showing as none. That's why we can conclude that this is a headless service. So get, as we see here, we have got headless services being created. Now let's try to see it is applying to the correct pod. Yes. Now let's try to delete the service, this one, load balancer. Okay, this service is being deleted now. Now in headless as a service, how we can use it? We have to use or make a curl to the pod IP. Okay, so k get pods hyphen o wide. So we will have the pod IP. So this is the nginx pod. What we have to do, make a call to the pod IP inside the same cluster. So currently we are in master node. We have to go to the worker node and we'll try to make a call to the pod IP. So copy of one of the pod IP, and we are in worker node now. Curl and the pod IP and the colon on which the pod is being exposed, on which port, that is 80 nginx pod is there. So as we can see here, we are getting the response. Let's try to make a call to another pod. Okay, let me see that if we are getting the response or not. Colon 80. So as we have seen that we are getting a response from both of the pod which is being exposed as a headless as a service. Let's discuss external name as a service. If you want to map the service of the content to the external name field, or just like this, which would return a CNAME record, means that if you're running any legacy time applications and if you have a CNAME record for that, it means that if you have a DNS name for that particular application, you want to route that particular traffic to a particular pod or a particular application which is running inside the Kubernetes cluster, you can use the external name service. So as you can see here, the use case for this service allow a service to refer an external service by a DNS name, useful for legacy system integration. So we'll see that how we can expose our same application to outside of the cluster with the help of external name field. So as you can see here, the same application which we have discussed in ClusterIP, NodePort and the load balancer, I have tried to expose the same application with the help of external name service. So as you can see here, this is the type for that particular service is external name. Cluster IP is showing as none. External IP, in the external IP is showing the external name field, that is example.com. Whatever we have it, we can mention in the external name. So and the port is showing as none because we are returning a CNAME record for that, and we are mapping our particular CNAME record with our services and to our running inside the pod. So this is an information about external name as a service. Now let's proceed and do some hands-on lab on external name and try to expose the same application with the external name as a service. So now let's proceed and create the last one, that is external name as a service. Now let's discuss external name as a service. K get svc here, k create svc external name. We are going to create external name with the help of imperative command. K create service external name. What would the name of external name service? Let it be nginx external, and we have to pass that parameter as well. What would be the CNAME record or content? External name is equal to, just like as for an example which we have seen, example.com. I'm just taking as a reference, and here it seems that L is being missed. Okay, and on which port we just want to be exposed? Okay, that is TCP is equal to 80. As we can see here, our type external name as a service has been created. As we can see here, Nginx external, the type is external name, cluster IP as none, and this is the external IP, that is example.com. Set up our service as an external name. Let me show you first that it is being mapped to correct service or not. If not, then we can change it, it's not an issue. Okay, get service hyphen o void. So as we can see here, while mentioning the name as nginx hyphen external, the selector is also make it at the same. So we have to change it. K edit svc nginx external. Okay, we have to change the selector from here nginx external to nginx. Okay, now let's try to see nginx. We are getting correct response. Curl. Yeah. So we need to enable some firewalls to have a communication. So that's why we are getting this a standard response. As we can see here, the domain is used for illustrative example and documents. You may use this domain for the prior asking for the permission. So the correct one. So this is it for exploring till the last. So as we have discussed that what is Kubernetes services, what are the various type of Kubernetes services along with their use cases, and we have discussed all of them in detail after doing the hands-on labs. So do comment on this video so that we can try to answer those questions in the comments. If required, we can connect and solve those issues as well. Thank you for watching. See you in next video.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.